The other thing that I put on here is you want to be sure that you've gotten Alan Bloom's Republic by the time you come back from break, and that you've done your commonplace book assignments.
You can find them free online too. I know there's a bunch of them. I can go back to Lowski's Canvas and see, because he posted a bunch of links on there.
Oh yeah, book 1 and book 2, so it's a little bit of a bigger reading, but you know, you have a while to do it. So, any questions before we move on? All right, so King Arthur, you pointed out, like, I wanted to bring up, there's 2 comments. Okay, so you made a comment to me about theology. Pablo, what did you ask me on, what did you tell me you noticed about this class?
Oh, well, I was saying that this being an ancient to medieval class, I was kind of surprised that it had less to do with theology or metaphysics, where we had a less of a focus on it than we did last semester, and I'd taken Civil War to like contemporary philosophy.
Right.
So we had more of a focus on metaphysics.
Okay, great. So I thought this was a fantastic insight. You were in my American political thought class from Reconstruction onwards, and you know, we ended the semester, pretty much everything after spring break had something to do with technology, communication, power, language, and artificial intelligence. And one thing you brought up was, you know, that this class is kind of odd, because when I came into this class, it's an ancient and medieval class. In a lot of ways, it seems like metaphysics and theology should kind of be coming up like in really explicit ways all the time. But in some ways, this class seems less explicitly theological and metaphysical than the American politics class when we got into the section on AI. And I think that's a really interesting thing to notice, because one of the things I'd say, ancient and medieval thought, in a lot of ways, I'd write this down, it is about political theology. And that's why we started out with this concept of sacral kingship. But one of the things, and it's come up a few times, is that for the ancients and medievals, there's no question about the divine and politics being united. Like, of course they're united. I've talked before about how the point of view in whatever civilization or culture that we're dealing with, that we've looked at so far, they think about politics as something that includes institutions and constitutions and stuff like that. But it's supposed to be a means of ordering and managing all of reality, really. It's much more holistic. And so they don't have an idea of politics and theology that separate out. Ancient and medieval politics is inevitably always going to involve political theology, because the question they're interested isn't, you know, is there something divine or not? It's, okay, the divine is there, so how do we structure the political? So you end up in this weird place, like you pointed out, where sometimes it seems like we have less conversations that are explicitly metaphysical or theological than we would in a class that's doing like a contemporary American political thought. Well, why is that? It's because they're all on the same page about God. The question, even the gods are different or whatever, you know, their theology, their metaphysics are different. But the idea that the politics should reflect or order the cosmos is accepted. The disagreement is about how to do this, right? The different variations are about how to do this. And in American political thought, it's weird because the later you get in American political thought and the more secular it becomes, in a way, the more theological the writings become, right? Because we aren't on the same page about that question the way that it is in the ancient world. And I thought that was a really, really good insight. And then what did you say about what our stories have in common with each other?
Well, I mean, if you kind of look back from the first set of King David readings, it all goes back to some guy liking some girl, and then just everything kind of falls apart. Like all the kingdoms will like go to like some of them just flat. You see it with this one, with the author readings, and you see it with the Iliad as well.
Very good. Everything we've dealt with so far, in at least, especially for the David story and the Iliad, and now this, a big part of the sort of political crisis has to do with a woman and a man, right? And in this case, Guinevere is in love with Lancelot, but she's married to Arthur. And, if you go back to the Iliad, we talked about Briseis and how Achilles is, set off an Agamemnon in relation to her, to fighting over her. She's their slave. But the whole story of Helen of Troy is about that too. David and Bathsheba, right? Yes. Very good.
Kind of bouncing off of what he said, I think it's more because the women are a symbol of power. Not necessarily that they're fighting over the girl herself. It's more so what she represents. Whoever can obtain the woman is known as the more powerful one, especially because grape is, seen as the way to best the other man. Like the story we read where
Fantastic.
he had to take the woman on the roof and what's the word? Do that to her,
right?
Everybody to kind of claim power,
and
so women are symbolization.
Okay, very good, very good, excellent point. So just to go back and think about David, the way that Absalom starts out as, and you guys did a fantastic job with this. He is responding to the failures of his father. And particularly what you see is the kingdom starts to fall when his father behaves in a predatory way, as opposed to in a way that is the sort of shepherd leader ideal that the early David is supposed to be. And then kind of the pinnacle of David's failure is when he moves from being the predator to being the person who cannot protect his family and his kingdom from predation. Okay, so he's the inverse.
I feel like all the kingdoms, though, we've looked at, especially that one and the Arthur one, they're all kind of founded on honor, unity, and it ultimately falls through the betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere. So.
Okay, I'm gonna write this down here because this is kind of the next place we need to go. So Absalom is supposed to be the one who rescues the kingdom, rescues his family from the father who is first a predator and then unable to protect from predators. But like you pointed out, his fall is that he becomes a predator like his dad. And in this specific way that we talked about, well, how is he advised to show his domination? How is he advised to show that he is in charge of the kingdom and not his father? He's told to violate his father's wives on the roof, which happens to be the roof where he saw Bathsheba from. And from that moment, he's become the thing he hates. He's become the thing that he's put all of his energy into defeating. And I think, you're right, Val. This is the woman, right, in these stories a lot of times is playing this role where she has some connection to vulnerability, which will then always bring up questions of power, right? Questions of power, desire and vulnerability, right? And we see that Bathsheba's like compared to a lamb, right, in the reading. Well, what's the implication? That, then David goes from being the one who kills the lion to being the lion that grabs the lamb and eats her. Now, this in a lot of ways is the core maybe of what's going on in the political theology of ancient and medieval political thought. Eros, desire, is a disruptor of order. So there's this idea that Eros, and it's always going to have a sexual valence, an erotic valence. And that's a lot of times why women come into play in texts that examine this. But when you get to the Republic, you see that Eros, actually the tyrant has Eros for power. And he has an unsatisfiable desire for power. So desire is this sort of powerful thing in humans that can be really disruptive and destructive. And in a lot of ways, what the ancients are interested in is how do we manage it? How do we control it? And they recognize that Eros and desire can make good things. In fact, you can't create without it. Okay, whether you're talking, about, and of course, this is a generalization, but to them, the idea that, you create life through desire, the artist creates art through desire. Everything that's created is coming from desire, too. So Eros is the disruptor, but it's also the beginning of everything new. And so this is maybe much more the core here. Now, you can see why this can become what it is in our other stories, as you guys pointed out, and why this motif recurs. Now, let's go back to this idea of founding. One thing you said, and I'm going to ask you guys some questions about Arthur in a little bit, but one thing you said is that the founding seems to start with honor and unity. Can you say more?
I mean, if you kind of look at like the Sword in the Stone story, it was kind of like his divine right to rule, and he had all these King Arthur was a good leader. He had all these amazing knights around him, and they were founded on honor, unity, and chivalry, and the code of the round table was code of conduct.
Yes, good.
Where they couldn't just go out and pillage; they actually had to follow his code. And it just kind of seems like there's a betrayal, and then it all just kind of goes downhill. Right.
This is you're right. You're exactly right. This is another corruption story. So the story of David, it's clearly a corruption story. And then Athens and Sparta are, right? Because they go from being this unified thing that is able to defeat the Persian Empire to being at war with each other in a way that destroys each society. Neither Athens nor Sparta survive intact the war that they have between each other. Pericles' high point, right? By the end, we're in the Million Dialogue. It's just force. This is a similar thing. You have this sort of miraculous beginning with the Sword and the Stone that leads to the creation of Camelot, and you have this sort of brilliant representation of politics in the Round Table. And Round Table, it shows a balance of power. It shows equality, right? They're not vying for hierarchy. They're all kind of aiming at the same thing. And part of how they live as their members of the Round Table is under this code of conduct, right? Which that's part of why we've been paying attention to roles and expectations. Each of these regimes has a corresponding idea about these are the roles and these are the expectations for inhabiting the roles. And this is a big part of how they manage conflict and they manage the disruptive things about Eros. Now, here's a question. How is Arthur born?
Well, is it Uther Pendragon?
Okay, so his dad's Uther Pendragon. Good.
He was a king of England before Arthur, and I guess he was kind of born not so good. Like he
Very good.
fell in love with Ingrid, who was married to another man, and then with Merlin's help, he kind of like disguised himself. And
Good. Good. Very good. Say more about Merlin. Say more about Merlin.
Merlin like cast a spell and like disguised him.
Right. So that he would look like who?
Like the Duke.
Good. Like who? Right. Yes. Okay. Like her husband. Right. So this is going to take a little bit of time to get situated, but this is where we need to start. So we talked last time about how the Arthur stories come. They do refer to a historical figure. And that historical figure is some kind of person who unites diverse warlords in a way that is able to fend off the Anglo-Saxons. Rome, we talked about how they went all the way up to Britain, to Wales. When their kingdom starts to fall apart, they leave. They can't be up there anymore. They cannot do what it takes to be able to defend this area. So even though they built Hadrian's Wall, they've got to pull all their soldiers to go back to the core of the empire and fight threats there. So Rome doesn't like fall in Britain all at once. It falls little by little. But historically, there are these sort of centers that kept Roman Britain kind of intact, I'd say kind of alive. And it is one of those cities that the historical Arthur comes from. Okay, that when Arthur enters manuscripts, it's first in histories written by monks. And the monks, of course, are people who are basically they're preserving knowledge while society is really disordered, right? So they're in these monasteries, they build knowledge, they keep knowledge away while there's all this conflict on the outside. And there was this place in history called Cirencester. Sorry, guys. And we think it was probably bigger than London. When it was under the Romans, it was called Corinthium. Our sort of best guesses are that this is where that figure came from. And what made him famous enough to be written about in these early monastic histories is that he was someone who managed to unite the different warlords who are in conflict with each other after Rome leaves. And Arthur is this Arthur figure, some other kind of warlord or warlord unifier. He's like, guys, we cannot fight each other. We have an external threat to fight. And what he seems to have done in a way, we said this at the end of last class, is he presents himself as Roman Britain without Rome. Okay, so trying to hold on to the things, the wealth, the stability, the prosperity of Rome, which of course by this point is Christian. This is who the figure of Arthur comes from. And so the figure of Arthur is someone who sits between political worlds. He's at the end of an empire. And after, what follows after Rome leaves, it's the invasion of the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, right? And then there's kind of an ongoing conflict, and then there's intermarriage, and then you basically have this land is a land of disjointed areas that don't really become unified until you have kings like Alfred and Athelstan who are able to bring it together. And the unification continues, over centuries. We think of it all as being the same, but it wasn't. So this is a long story, right? And Arthur's just the beginning of a story of people who are going to have to work out their problems with each other to have stability. He's the beginning of that story. Because after Rome leaves, there's a sense in which a lot of stuff falls apart. Now, Mallory, you're reading Le Morte d'Arthur, right? So you're reading Mallory's interpretation of the Arthurian myths. Those are like going back to the 6th century, right? And so the text you're reading, Mallory is writing during, the War of the Roses. Do you guys know what that is? Tell me.
It's essentially, I forget what king started it. I think it was King Richard. No, but it was basically like a bunch of wars that spanned over like 100 years about just who was like the new king of England, and it ended with Henry the Eighth or Henry the Seventh.
Yes, good, right? So this is basically a massive civil war, a massive succession crisis. Very good. So you could see it in terms like if we're going back to the David story, one of the things you guys asked is, okay, so like after David dies, how does this go? Well, King Solomon seems to start off good in some ways, but in other ways, he goes off the rails, and it all falls apart, right? It all falls apart. Why? Because of succession crisis. Okay, succession. There's not an agreement on who should rule next. The Civil War, that's spurred on by the War of the Roses. This is a succession crisis too. And succession crises are always about legitimacy, legitimate authority. Who should rule, right? And like a part of that, a subset of that is the ruler someone who has authority by blood? Or are they someone that has authority by law? And if they have authority by law, does that come from because they're really good? They're really powerful? Because God chose them? Do they come because of consent of the governed? Yes.
Isn't it typically just because of like divine intervention and divine choosing?
Yes, fantastic.
I'm king because I'm king, so I've been chosen by God.
Yes, very good, right? So like this is like when we talk about ancient and medieval as kind of just being political theologies. This is exactly what I mean, right? Is, well, how do you handle the problem of political power, political legitimacy? Well, there's a connection between the will of the divine and the ruler, right? And so in this case, with Arthur, the fictional Arthur, the mythological Arthur, his legitimacy comes from something magical, right? Something divine in the miracle of the sword and the stone. And in a lot of ways, you could say, these questions I raised here about, okay, who should rule? Is it by blood, by law? And then dividing it up into, like, do you choose by virtue, power, God, consent? In a way, the sword and the stone handles all of that, right? You don't even, at least at first, it seems to handle all of that. You don't have these succession questions, which would have been on Mallory's mind because of the time that he lived, right? And the historical Arthur lived in a similar type of time where there's a legitimacy crisis, right? And a succession crisis. But this is where the way Arthur is conceived matters. Okay, yes?
It's like, the question, like, who rule, like, if it was just, like, acceptable back then to just kind of start your own war, like, why wasn't, like, a thing, like, in Athens? Because they had, like, the first democracy, right?
Oh, good question. Okay, so
why didn't, like, people just, I should rule and just raise an army and take over the city?
Okay, here's a good, why shouldn't I raise an army, take over the city, right? So, and you gave a good thought experiment, right? Like, why in Athens didn't, like, some warlord just rise up and take over the whole city, and just be like, I'm doing it because I can. Yes.
It's about tyranny, like, I guess, how people view you.
How people view you.
Like the reception of their rule.
The reception of the rule. Yes. Okay, good. And there's some connection of virtue. This is, you guys are asking fantastic questions, making fantastic points.
I mean, like, you just had a big army that just quiet down, you're gonna get stabbed with a spear.
Good. Right? Why wouldn't force be enough? So, and so why wouldn't force be enough? And then you brought up reception of rule. This is really interesting. What you guys are both sort of circling around is political legitimacy. And where does it come from? How does it work? One of the problems with the Iliad is that, Achilles is the strongest. But does it seem like people want to be ruled by Achilles? No. Why not?
They didn't see him as legitimate, right? Like, it was just kind of, he's just this really strong guy, but, like, he doesn't have any claim to rule.
Okay, right. So for one thing, he's not Agamemnon, who does, like, have a title as a king, right? So how can Agamemnon confront Achilles at all when Achilles is super powerful? Well, because he has a title as a king. Yes. His anger. Yes. Excellent, guys. Good. And you could think of eros and desire and anger. They're sorted out more in Plato's Republic. But the idea, of course, is that these are very strong passions, right? Or strong instincts, strong movements in the human soul. And so what is the reason that these people, even though they can see how powerful Achilles is, they don't want to live under him? Well, he's dangerous. Like you said, he's angry. He has all this power, and he doesn't have a lot of, like, in modern language, emotional regulation. Politics just becomes, like, at certain times for the Athenians, or not for the Athenians, for the Greeks, it becomes, how do we manage Achilles' emotional dysregulation? Politics is all about managing this person who's a threat to all of us if they explode. Okay, well, what's the problem with a society like that? Yes.
Oh, I wanted to bring it back.
Oh yeah, bring it up.
To the, like, original thought question. Was aside from the problem of, like, political legitimacy and, like, all those other things, there's also, like, the actual logistics of doing that. I feel like
good,
because it is so decentralized. I don't even know how you would begin to, like, round up that type of army. Not to mention, like, then I mean, I feel like the logistics of it would be super unstable.
Okay, good, right. This is y'all's interactions, your thought experiments, you're interacting with each other. It's really right on, because one of the things that you see in every text we've dealt with so far is that while part of political authority seems to come from power and strength, right? There's also a real sense in which stability is what gives legitimacy. Like political legitimacy seems to have some connection to stability, that people want a ruler who will give them a stable way of life. Why? Because, most of us just want to be with our family and friends, do something with our time that we like to do, have enough to eat, safe place to be. We don't want a lot of drama, right? We want stability is a context of living our lives, and we don't want to be cannibalized by random angry political leaders. And so, what's the fear? It's the predator-prey, right? Well, but you start to see part of the reason that David has a legitimacy crisis is because he can't bring stability, right?
I guess you do kind of see that in the Wars of the Roses. Henry II,
Good.
He kind of stabilized it. He went over to France, and I think he became like the French king for a little bit too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very good. That's a good point. So he uses a combination of war and political movers, but the point is that he's trying to make it all tend towards stability.
And he brought stability to the
Yes, and that's part of why they're going to say, okay, we're okay with this. This is legitimate. Yes.
I was going to say, when you were talking about stability, I think that it can also tie to predator and prey. Not predator and prey, but I was thinking more terms real government scenarios with North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
From the outside, many people, especially Americans, don't see how North Koreans can live in North Korea and how they stay under such an oppressive regime.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is, many North Koreans, quote unquote, like Kim Jong-un and
right.
like the regime that they're under because of the stability. Because even though he himself is a very chaotic leader and could be seen as like the predator prey type person, he's established a very specific kind of environment that they have to live in. So even though it's chaotic, it's kind of like a organized chaos, if that makes sense.
That's interesting. No, go ahead. Keep going.
No, I was just saying that ties back into it because, like you said, people want stability regardless if it's to their own detriment or not. They just want something predictable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting and important insight, because like a lot of times if you're talking about real world politics or you're talking about regime design, one thing you have to, and Machiavelli says this in the Discourses and in the Prince, one thing you have to ask is basically what are the citizens used to? What have they lived through? And if you have a ruler who's really authoritarian and maybe perhaps tyrannical, but they're bringing stability and the people lived under a time of chaos and starvation and instability before, they might find it like you have to compare, right? What is it that the before times felt like? And in a lot of cultures, before times that are tied to extreme deprivation and extreme loss, right? That's the ultimate chaos. That's the ultimate thing that you don't want. And so I think that's right. That's something, because one of the things we haven't really said explicitly here, but you guys have done a great job of raising, is that in a way, ancient and medieval forms, we see them as being less democratic, and they are, but they're not entirely non-consensual. A tyrant becomes something that is the people aren't consenting, right? You get a predator-prey point, and the people kind of seem to revoke. But implicit in everything we've said so far is that a part of political legitimacy is the people receiving the rule. Okay, the people they don't consent in the way that we consent, and in modernity, but there's always in everything we've looked at, there's a certain element of will the rule be tolerated, and the rule seems to be tolerated when people can have a peaceful life. Yes, do you have something to say?
I mean, this kind of the stability thing is like pre-American Revolution, like it was pretty stable. Like the British Army and the King were
good.
Providing for the security like of the colonists, but the colonists like still revolted. Like I don't really like. How can you explain that?
No, I mean this is part of this is. I taught Machiavelli in my other class today, and like Machiavelli is a major departure point in the history of political thought. The American Revolution is a major departure point. Of course, it's much later, but there's similar themes going on. And one of the things that the American Revolution has as opposed to the French is like the French Revolution is happening in a time of great inequality. Well, but that's the thing is they're both inspired by the Enlightenment. And the French, you have these people who are living these lives that are extremely difficult in the midst of great luxury and chaos. But the American case, it's not a parallel. However, even though there does seem to be comparative political stability, there's still this revolution. And it is a really interesting historical moment. Yes?
I would say, well, in another class, our professor was talking about how he basically went down through like 100 years of American kind of political thought, and when it started with charters and like covenants and all these, it started from a place of like self-governance.
Good.
And so they actually had that like stability of their own self-governance, and then when that changed with the British Crown wanting to impose more taxes and like more centralized control, sort of, that's kind of what I think changed the stability.
Okay, very good, right? So this goes back to the point again about what people are used to, what they will tolerate. So what kind of system existed in colonial America before, you get the moment of the American Revolution? Well,
it's kind of like House of Commons people, I guess, it was approved by the British, like that they could rule by themselves, but you had British governors who would report to the king.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, basically what's happened is this is a colony of Britain, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of running itself like its own place. And the British are okay with that as long as they still get the material goods. So people are modeling the types of political and deliberative behavior they had at home, which can have a lot to do with charters, a lot to do with town hall meetings, other forms of self-rule. This goes on for generations and generations. And when the king becomes uncomfortable with the level of autonomy in the colonies, he tries to assert the monarchical privileges. They've already lived in a way that is close to a lot of so like they don't want to fight. The revolution didn't go straight to revolution. The first thing they wanted was to be represented, right, for taxation, yes, in parliament. They didn't move straight to revolution. They were like, no, we want the colonies to have representation when you guys make the law. That was the first thing that they asked for. Why? Because basically they're saying, we've ruled ourselves, we've taken all these principles that you live by, we've applied them here, and now you're not being fair. Like, because this is how you live inside the core of the empire, you're treating us like we're subservient or inferior. And so again, it goes back to what people will tolerate, what they are used to, what they find acceptable. And so you could say that for a lot of Americans at the time, the calculation was stability wasn't enough, right? But it kind of has a certain thing to do with what they're used to, what they expect. All of this is to say that all questions of political legitimacy have something to do with citizen formation and citizen psychology. What's really interesting about Arthur as a myth is that he is basically in the picture as a myth from the 6th century onwards. That's generations and generations of Arthuriana. That's what the Arthur mythology is called, because there's so many different texts, so many different stories, so many different writers, because it goes over hundreds and hundreds of years. But what the story is always about at its core, whether you're talking about the legends or you're talking about the historical figure it's based on, is a unifier who brings peace and stability out of chaos, to the point that it almost becomes legendary. So political psychology, it is a unifier, a longed for unifier who brings peace and stability out of chaos. Whether you're talking about the Arthur who's the warlord, gets the warlords fighting each other so they can get along and defend themselves and have this period of peace. Or, you're talking about Arthur in the text you're reading, where he literally gets into a battle with the Roman emperor at one point. And this is the myth of Arthur, right? That's being written during the time of the War of the Roses, when there isn't stability, when there's tons of conflict, when there's not unity.
Like the unifier.
Mm-hmm.
In another class, we're looking at Otto von Bismarck, who unified like the German Empire.
Good.
It was like a bunch of independent German states, and they kind of look at him like a hero too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, to us, we kind of underemphasize how, we think the European countries we have now are like they were always there. And in a lot of ways, they're products of wars and treaties over time that then find these unifier figures who will create unity where there isn't any.
George Washington was kind of a unifier too.
Well, and it's true, because the colonies are separate, then they're supposed to make a nation. Or you can think about Rome, right? One of Rome, the brilliant thing about Rome, part of why it's so good at maintaining power, is because it's able to constantly introduce new political groups into itself and maintain unity at the same time. For a long time, they were able to do that. And they might have to devise different ways of doing it, but they did it for quite a long time before they fell. And so that unity, bringing together parts into the whole, is an important part of politics, and of political leadership, and what we sort of long for, right? When we long for a good politics. Why did Rome fall?
Or I guess how did it fall?
Well, okay, here's a good example. Like with the Arthur stuff, I told you they built Hadrian's Wall, like basically to keep that area unified and protected from invasion and under Roman rule. And it seemed like a lot of the local people that they had started to integrate into Romanitas, and you have this peculiar Roman Britain thing going on after a couple of generations that the historical Arthur would have kept alive or had last longer. And actually, like a lot of English or UK history is the Roman part and the Anglo-Saxon part coming together over time. But what starts to happen is basically they overextend themselves. They can't defend everything that they've now claimed for their empire. And so they just don't have enough. I mean, their administration the military have allowed them to do all of this, but at a certain point, it's just too much. It's too big. And so they're dealing with problems at home. The core is not protected enough militarily, partly because they overextended themselves. So now they've got to pull military from the periphery. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's part of why people will say Rome kind of falls over time. Like, you can talk about falls of Rome and important dates or important times that Rome, the city, is invaded. But like, historically speaking, it's a decline that happens as, you know, they just cannot maintain the empire against threats. Because, you know, they've I mean, think about the fact that they went all the way up to Wales. It's kind of crazy that they're like running Wales, like. Mm-hmm. It's a really crazy idea. So so you can see, and the fall of Rome in a way is always something that's with us. It's like the fall of a god. A lot of ancient and medieval thought, well, I should say, a lot of post-Roman thought, post-fall of Rome thought is going to play with that. Machiavelli is going to play with that. All right, so here's the thing. In the myth that we're dealing with, and the legend of Arthur that we're dealing with, Arthur comes from his dad, Uther Pendragon, head of the dragon, and Igraine. Now, he is in a period of time where the different kind of warlords of the area are disjointed, and he is trying to bring unity. He's trying to consolidate power, right? It seems like after the death of the king, he's having the most success at this. There's a succession crisis. He's the one who seems to be most successfully filling the vacuum. What happens is he gets struck with desire for Gorlois, his wife, right, the Duke. So this would be a rival for power, right? You either have to conquer him, or you have to get him to agree to join under you. And so in the middle of this campaign and this sort of attempt to consolidate power, this erotic desire disrupts. And it shows him as sort of being driven mad with it. Yes? Oh, do you have to? Oh, it's okay. You're fine. So the problem is she's not going to be like, yeah, you know, I'm into you, Uther. Let's play, right? That's not gonna happen. I mean, that doesn't happen that much now. I mean, it can, but like, I mean, you don't go up to a married woman and just think it's all gonna go well for you. But like back then, especially, you know, no, right? That could end in death for a lot of different people. So how does Uther handle this? He tricks her.
With the help of Merlin, Merlin and another knight go disguised as the Duke's knights into her castle.
Very good. Very good. They know that they are not going to be able to seduce her. So they're going to have to deceive her. And Uther convinces Merlin, who's magical. He is some type, if you were talking about this in Greek terms, he'd be some kind of demigod. Uther convinces him to go ahead and turn him into physically appearing to be her husband. And so it's deceit. And Arthur comes out of that deceit. That's how he's born. Now, of course, this is not consensual. At the time, in some ways, some audiences are going to receive it as romantic. But I think it's actually a really important, it's an important moment, because even if they're not articulating it in the language that we have about consent, it's definitely seen as an infraction of some kind, a deceit, right? And so Arthur is born of some kind of injustice. And that's really important to point out. Arthur, he is the king that brings honor, unity, stability. How is Arthur born? Arthur is born through injustice and deceit. Now, you have to go a little bit behind the text. We talked about the Arthur legends are referred to as Arthuriana. So this is one of the most authoritative texts, but it's later, and there's lots of other stories over generations. And one of the things that is kind of, it's like the Marvel universe almost. That's how I think about it. And you know, there's like different versions of Marvel and like different storylines, and then the comics kind of build up. Okay, that's basically what Arthuriana is like. So Merlin is a figure that his backstory and that buildup of stuff over time is that he is the son of a woman, a human woman, who is attacked by a demon. Okay, that's really important. He's a son of a human woman who's attacked by a demon. So he is part spirit, part more than human, and part human. And it's not, it's an attack, right? It's not a love story. But kind of what happens is that Merlin, in this universe, his mother, even though he's a product of this, she loves him. Not because of what happened, but almost in spite of what happens. And this is symbolized by her making the decision to give this baby her father's name, because she loves her father, and he is an honorable and good man. So she basically humanizes him. She makes a decision to love him, to humanize him. And so he becomes this figure that in Arthuriana is very conflicted. There's lots of different Merlins, and like Merlin can be pretty awful, and he can also be pretty great. And it's not the same person writing the Merlin stories. But the basic concept is this is someone who comes out of this union and has these powers, but because of the love of his mother, he wants to use his powers for good. He wants to use his powers for the good of humans. Now, in this case, you might say you could read Merlin in this particular example as thinking Uther is Uther. There's no way Uther is not going to blow this. Like, he is almost reaching political stability. Now he's out of control of his appetites. He's going to basically lead us into another civil war, or more civil war. Because it's if he were to attack this queen, it would mean that it's not the same as defeating him on battle. It's not the same as defeating her husband in battle, which everyone might accept. People would be like, they're not gonna live under Uther, right? He is this tyrant. So you could read Merlin as saying, okay, this is what he's gonna do. This is what Uther's gonna do either way. And I can either make it happen in a way that allows for stability, or I can let this disaster, unfold. So he agrees to disguise Uther so Uther can get what he wants. And that is how Arthur's born. Now, this complicates what Arthur is in a lot of ways, because once you have read the beginning of this text, on the one hand, you know that Arthur is the bringer of justice, unity, and this glorious moment called Camelot. And you have technically the founding story of the Sword and the Stone, which is a mystical, magical story where his, he has to basically be hidden because he is this child and he gets raised by this one good knight. And because the kingdom needs someone just, cosmologically, this miracle of the sword and the stone allows him to make himself known, right? Because he's the one who can pull the stone out, and we'll talk more about that. But go back further. What is behind the story of the sword and the stone? Behind the sword and the stone are two rapes, right? Basically, effectively. It is how Arthur is born, and it's how Merlin is born. Okay? And Arthur himself, who is sort of this fount of justice, is someone who is himself founded in injustice. Which doesn't mean he's not just. It's a tension of the story. And Merlin, like I said, you can read him as, I'm going to use unjust means to get this just end, right, of political stability. He himself is someone who comes out of an injustice, but because his mother loves him and humanizes him, he wants to use his powers for good. Well, how does he do that? Through deceit. And so what you have in a way is this great unifier who brings peace, stability, glory, and justice. But the beginning of it all is in something very, very ugly. Mm-hmm. 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 No, you're making a lot of sense.
A lot of times, people who want to change the system, they come in power to
Right.
or they come into power by throwing it to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like, it's really ever just we the people say,
Right.
not even we the people, but just like based on the story, it's just like sunshine and rainbows, the state that way.
Yeah.
Politics is always drifted through some sort of
Mm-hmm.
story.
Through conflict.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, you nailed it. Go back, if you guys think about what MacIntyre said, too. Philosophical traditions are birthed through conflict. And so conflict, even the person who wants to unify and who wants to harmonize and restore, right, to a greater or lesser extent, there is a story of conflict. And I think you're right to point to that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it kind of ties back to me because it's like the birth of Christianity, especially here in the States, was used very violent and
Interesting, yeah.
means.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With imperialism, trying to spread the gospel through
Right.
taking people's resources and
Yes.
their land and things like that. And so it's just interesting how it's like that, like I said,
Mm-hmm.
through religion where it's supposed to be good and good and yada yada, it's still birthed from some sort of wrong.
That's a really, okay, so this kind of brings us to one of the things I think that Arthur is the most fascinating, or one of the reasons he might be the most fascinating in this context is the legend of Arthur, like you pointed out, he's an ideal, and especially he's an ideal of the idea of the Christian king and what is a title of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, right? And it's important to point out that in the way that Jesus would have been thought of when Arthuriana is created, Jesus is someone who is being chased by political powers, empires, and who has to become a hidden child. He has to flee to Egypt. The same way that Arthur has to become a hidden child. And so you're definitely making, like, the reader would see that comparison. And Arthur as a king, you know, kind of his fall, you can say, well, maybe, well, we'll talk more about his fall later. But it almost seems like the story of Camelot is the idea that what is perfect or just and beautiful simply is not able to survive in a permanent way on earth. That's one interpretation of Arthur. Now, as you point out, what you see comes out in a lot of the story of American Christianity is that at the same time, while you might have these beautiful and just things like presented as ideals or paths of life, and even people who become dominated into the religion might end up loving, you know, Christ in the religion. What is the story of its founding? And as you pointed out, it's through a lot of violence, right, and force. Yes. Yes. Good.
Because, like, I mean, comparing like Rome with the United States and stuff, like Rome is like a lot more favorably about like Arthur and other things like after its fall because it employed a lot of like cultural relativity.
Good.
So when
Very
they
good.
would like take over a new place, they would just kind of connect their gods to those gods.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like I took like a Latin class and stuff, and there was like kings in England that still like had a level of like political authority. Obviously not like a lot, but they were like representative.
Right.
But with like here, we're not going to be looked upon favorably by indigenous peoples because it was about erasing culture instead.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't Rome pretty tyrannical though?
Well, yeah.
In the Gaul, a lot of the tribes did not like Rome.
Well, this is I mean, you guys are hitting on a really, really interesting point because both of what you guys have said is true. So, like, one of the reasons that Rome can last for as long as it does is because it does this thing called syncretism. Yes, it's like if you guys can keep, you know, we're going to be in charge of you, but as long as you give us, you know, your goods in the way that we said, and somebody, you give us tribute, we're not going to take all of it, right? Well, we're going to be in charge of you. You'll get to keep most of what you have and most of the life you have. And that a part of that was the gods, right? You guys can keep your gods. We're not even going to take away your gods from you. But you just have to add our gods. You have to add our Roman gods to yours. And you have to participate in our religious festivals. And that worked for a long time. That's part of why their empire was able to grow as much as it did. was because, yeah, there was force, but also they would induct into themselves through syncretism parts of the original place. And so in that sense, you know, they're conquerors, and in that way they're tyrannical, but in another way they're not perfectly tyrannical, in the sense that they're saying you have to be exactly like us now. And that's part of why they live. Now, when they meet the Gauls, this is one of the first moments where their empire is going to run into a time when they're going to meet people who won't make that deal. The Israelites are another example of people who will not make that deal. And so when their empire, which works through syncretism, encounters someone who won't make the deal, that's when things fall apart. Yes?
Like that's also like a level of input to the fall of Rome as well.
Very good, yeah.
With each like new conquest, they destabilize their own like theological or whatever system. And I mean, like, because I feel like Christianity is kind of implied to be a level of destabilizing factor in Rome.
Yes.
Because that's like the next regime. But
right.
And with places like Egypt, they couldn't really induct that like level of connection just because of like the differences and stuff. And a lot of Romans really appreciated that like Egyptian mythology offered like an afterlife and stuff.
Yes, that's.
They disconnected a level from Rome.
That's a good point. Yeah, we have sources, for example, that say the Romans, you know, they admired, maybe even kind of envied the Egyptian focus and systematization of the afterlife, right? Because it offered more than their own religion. It's the same of, you know, even though they don't like the Israelites, there's also a lot of Romans who are kind of in love with the idea of a God that loves you, because the Roman gods don't love you. They hate you, or they don't give a shit. Either one. Yeah, Greek gods are the same. It's true, right? So even though the Romans have this other way, like these other political theologies kind of destabilize them in the hearts of their citizens potentially. And when Christianity takes over in Rome, in a lot of ways, it's because the elite have to admit it's not going away. It's not going away, so we have to be in charge of it. And why did that catch on? Well, because it had something the Romans were looking for too. It had equality. God is this poor carpenter that's crucified. All the slaves in Rome, they're the first ones who became Christians. All right, you guys are doing great. So next time, I'll post a lecture. You try to read it about, if you can, half of the next reading, which I think is book 20. Oh, sorry. I mean for Wednesday. Yeah. But yes, when I see you again, you'll want to have read book 1 and 2 of the Republic, and you'll have a quiz on it. Okay? Yeah, I can post a video on the Republic. I'll do something.
I remember reading the first chapter. It was like, what's going on?
Yeah. Okay. Good idea. I can do that. I will do that.
And then we also have our common books to that.
Yeah, when you come back. Yeah, for sure. And just let me know if you have questions. But the video's there. All right, you guys are all doing a great job. Have a safe break. No quiz. No quiz.